Welcome to the Innovator Spotlight, a podcast featuring conversations with some of the most innovative leaders, designers, and technologists in the health sciences. I'm Sean Grace, and today's guests are Dr. Philippe Szapary and Dr. Yasmine Wasfi. Dr. Szapary is the Vice President and Clinical Development Head at the Lung Cancer Initiative at Janssen Janssen. Prior to his role at LCI, Dr. Szapary had a similar role working in late-stage clinical development in immunology at Janssen Pharmaceuticals, where he oversaw the pipeline for dozens of clinical trials. Dr. Wasfi is a Senior Director Clinical Development at the Lung Cancer Initiative at Janssen Janssen. Prior to her role at LCI, Dr. Wasfi was a clinical lead for dermatology and GI R&D at Janssen, where, along with Dr. Szapary, she oversaw the successful development and launch of the groundbreaking psoriasis drug Tremfya. That multi-year effort won them both the 2020 Janssen Medal for Research and Development, the most prestigious award given for R&D excellence at Janssen Janssen. I want to welcome you both to the podcast.
Thank you, John.
And congratulations to both of you for the well-deserved Janssen Medal Award. And I want to get into that in a moment. But before we do that, so in light of Janssen's COVID vaccine and all this attention to vaccine and vaccine development, do you miss your colleagues at Janssen and the world of drug development? Yasmine?
I think I'll speak for myself. I'm certainly very proud of the efforts that went on at Janssen that led to the vaccine. I think one of the sort of fun things about starting to work in a new area is taking all of the learnings from our experience at Janssen and being able to apply them in a new space and across sectors. So super proud of everything that Janssen continues to accomplish and happy to be kind of taking those learnings forward.
Terrific. Philippe, any comment about that?
In addition to being just proud, I'm also amazed because I know how much work goes on behind the scenes to make a drug from sort of inception to the market. I know how hard that is. And to do it in such a short amount of time with such a tremendous pressure and anticipation is got to be one of the hardest, but also most rewarding things they've ever done in their lives. So, huge kudos to them. And I feel a Janssen medal in their future.
I would agree with that. So tell me about the work you did at Janssen that led to the Janssen medal. Yasmine?
So we both worked on the clinical development program for a drug called guselkumab or Tremfya, and worked on it, in Philippe's case, from the very beginning, from the phase 1 study, all the way through phase 3 and ultimately approval for the treatment of patients with moderate to severe plaque psoriasis.
Mm-hmm. Philippe, any...
So it was sort of like a relay, right, where I started the very early part of the drug development process. So from the understanding what this molecule was that we were making in the labs, all the way through the first in human testing, and demonstrating that it had efficacy in patients with the psoriasis, and then working with Yasmine, hand in hand for that second part of the relay, taking it through what we call the dose ranging, or sort of testing the optimal dose, which is a very important step, to finally what we call the confirmatory phase 3 studies, right, where we definitively demonstrate, the role of this drug in the treatment of psoriasis. So a really rewarding journey from start to finish.
So please tell me about your current work at the Lung Cancer Initiative.
So I can start. So I work in Philippe's clinical development group within the Lung Cancer Initiative. And the Lung Cancer Initiative, or the LCI, is a cross-sector effort. So Janssen Janssen has a pharma sector, a medical device sector, as well as a consumer sector. And the mission of LCI is to leverage the strengths across all of these sectors towards the end of earlier diagnosis and treatment of lung cancer. And the reason for that essentially is that this is true of many cancers, but I think particularly in the case of lung cancer, patients come to clinical attention and are most commonly diagnosed with very late stage disease. And for that reason, their survival tends to be quite poor. And so one of the main levers that we can pull to try to improve survival from the disease is to shift that diagnosis and treatment earlier. So that broadly is what we're working on. And there are a number of kind of specific efforts to that end that are ongoing in the LCI.
Gotcha. Now, Philippe, is this a screening and diagnosis effort, or is this also treatment and therapeutic?
Yeah, Sean, it spans across the gamut of these things, right? So I'll just speak a little bit to the various work that Yasmine was referring to give you a flavor of the work that we do. So we do have a part of our group that's specifically focused on screening, not just increasing awareness about the importance of screening, but also looking at new ways of identifying the highest risk patients from screening. As you may know, screening for lung cancer is done in identifying high-risk groups and then getting a chest CT scan, which is a sort of a fancy X-ray, and identifying abnormalities on that scan that can be worked up further through biopsy or surveillance. It's not well adopted in the U.S. right now, and that may change, as you may have heard, Sean, that there's been an update to the guidelines to actually get more people screened for lung cancer earlier, and which is great news, I think, for the field. But we're looking at techniques to apply to those scans, to look deeper to those scans and tell us which of those nodules, which of those abnormalities are most likely going to represent an early cancer. So that's just an example of some of the work we're doing in that space. On the treatment side, as Yasmine pointed out, what we're really focused in on is that stage 1 or lung cancer, or even stage 0. There is such a thing as sort of this pre-cancer zone, if you will, like right before it becomes a cancer. It's called stage 0. And that early phase is where we're focused on, right? So that's a phase that's largely been ignored in lung cancer, but in other diseases, we've done quite well in that space. And I think now we're turning our attention to lung cancer. Are there specific therapies, whether they be drugs that you take systemically, or even drugs that you could inject into a specific lesion to help treat or reduce the risk of recurrence of those lesions? Another example would be energy, applying heat or microwave energy as an example to those lesions as a way of getting rid of them, either before they become cancer or as part of the treatment paradigm for very early stage. And so this is where, from the LCI's perspective, because we are cross-sector, we work on the medical device side, that's the energy side, as well as the drug side, as well as the diagnostic side, and trying to bring all those together to come up with solutions for this terrible disease.
How would you define a stage 0?
Yeah, so stage 0 is a fairly new term to describe what they call adenocarcinoma in situ. You may have heard of that term, or an in situ carcinoma is the very beginnings of cancer, but it hasn't even spread outside of itself, not at all. And there's also a condition called microinvasive, again, very minimally spread outside of its original form. Those are very early lesions that you can intervene in and have excellent outcomes long-term compared to even stage 1 disease.
Now, I'd read something in your case, Philippe, regarding robotic bronchoscopy, and I guess that falls into the device category, right? Could you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, so that's a relatively new technology. It's been probably around now for about 2 years, and essentially it takes the precision of robotics and applies it to what has been a traditionally manual intervention called bronchoscopy. So what that is basically taking a camera at the end of a flexible scope and going through your mouth into your airways to look at your airways and identify abnormalities for biopsy or treatment. Robotic in general, as we know, has provided some significant advances. The articulations on this newer bronchoscope are very precise and can move in lots of different directions and angulations. It also has a camera at the end, which has very good sort of optics that you can see what you're doing. And it's also very, very thin compared to traditional bronchoscopy, and allows you to reach parts of the airways and the lungs that weren't being able to be reached before. So it's a very exciting technology that's part now of the J&J family, and one that Yasmine and I are working on in the context of being able to administer both drugs and as well as energy to treat some of these lesions that we were talking about.
Wow, very exciting, innovative, and interesting work at hand, indeed. That's some pretty cool stuff. I'm just going to switch gears for a moment here, talk a little about your career paths. Yasmine, you have both an MD and a PhD. Did you set out with sort of research in mind, or did you have a more clinical medicine career on your mind in the beginning?
I think I always envisioned having research as part of my career, and particularly with a focus, though, on clinical research. My PhD is actually in clinical science, and so I had a good grounding in a number of subject areas that are relevant to the world of clinical research. And I did pursue that initially in the setting of academic medicine. And then made the transition to working in basically sort of a similar vein, but obviously the different context of pharma. But for me, it was a very rewarding transition in the sense that in at least in my experience in pharmaceutical drug development, it's much easier to sort of connect the dots. A lot of times in academics we talk about going from bench to bedside. And I think in pharma, you're a lot closer to that, and you do actually, it's a lot, in some ways it's easier to sort of draw those lines and create that path from the scientific discoveries to actually therapies that impact patients.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. But it's not always the easiest transition from academia into industry. But in your case, based on your passions and your training as well, it seems like you've landed in a pretty good spot.
Yeah, I think so. If you had asked me when I was in my training whether I thought that ultimately I'd be working in pharmaceutical drug development, I probably would have said no. But in the end, I think it was a very sort of natural progression from my training. Yes.
Now, Philippe, you trained in economics, is that right?
I had a bachelor's degree in economics in college. Yeah. So interestingly enough, my path to where I am today, takes me through my parents. My dad was an economist. My mom was a bench scientist at the NIH. And I knew I loved science, but I didn't want to shortchange my dad. So I figured I better know what my dad does. So I started taking some econ classes while I was also doing the pre-med work. And actually my interest was in health economics at the time. So I was sort of a little bit of a melding of the two. But when I emerged on the other side of undergraduate, I was pretty committed to going right to medical school. And that's what I did.
And how do you feel the economics schooling shaped your perspective or the path that you ended up taking, or maybe how it even informs how you see things now?
It's a great question. And no one's ever asked me that. And I'd have to really think back to sort of what I was thinking at the time. Honestly, I don't think it's really impacted my thinking all that much. It was a theoretical kind of economics type of environment, right? So we're learning about policy changes and how that would affect people's adoption of healthcare, as an example. But as I look back sort of more broadly at my career, beyond the economics, I ended up getting a master's in epidemiology, which probably shaped my career a lot more. So you asked Yasmine the question about where the research degree or the clinical degree. I went in this strongly thinking I'd be a clinician. and started seeing patients right out of my residency without subspecialty training, and realized after a couple of years of that I really missed the research side of it. So I went back and got a degree in epidemiology, and that really sparked the interest in clinical research. I ended up leaving clinical medicine to just exclusively dedicate, the rest of my career in academics to clinical investigation. And that still has really shaped, me and my thinking and my team's thinking now is really around how do you design studies to answer specific questions to get, to make real progress in healthcare. And we applied it to drugs and immunology, and now we're doing it with devices and drugs and combinations of the two now in the lung cancer space.
Right, and it all comes full circle at LCI. Now, one of the major themes of this podcast is innovation, right? Where it comes from, what inspires it, what are the conditions that provide the most fertile environment for innovation. And I was thinking lately about drug development in particular, and I don't know if this is true, but it's certainly something I've read here and there, that the age of sort of like big blockbuster drug development is behind us. Maybe the 1980s may have been the peak in some minds. That was a period that development was the most robust, and since then maybe there's been a decline in the drug discovery and the drug development arena. What do you think about that, Yasmine? Do you have any perspectives on where we might be at and what might contribute, if it's even true, in the decline of major breakthroughs in drug development?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I have a perception that particularly in drug development, let's say over the past, 30 years, that there was a period of time where science was ahead of drug development. And so there was some low-hanging fruit. There was science that was well understood that hadn't been actioned yet with drugs that targeted, whatever the pathways were that the science had defined. And so I think that's where you saw sort of a flurry of blockbuster drugs, where the science was well established, and it just required the clinical development programs to leverage that. I think I feel like now it's more tied, right? The scientific advances are coming sort of iteratively at the same time that we're trying to advance drug development. And so if you look at a space like oncology, where the science is very fast moving, I feel like innovation is happening all the time. Now, not all of those drugs certainly make it to market, but literally on a daily basis, we are being informed about, a new mechanism that's being tried, a new trial that just read out, so I do feel like, there is still a lot of innovation happening. Maybe the funnel has gotten, I don't know what the right word is to describe it, but sort of the number of tries that you need to get ultimately to a successful program is higher. But I don't know. My perception is that there is a ton of innovative thinking and research still going on, and it just maybe is a little bit harder now to get it, across the finish line.
Mm-hmm. Philippe, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I agree with what Yasmine said about the low-hanging fruit have been taken, right? The drugs that we're developing now are so much more complex. They're, I'll give you an example of the space we're looking at, right? We're not looking at directly injecting drugs into tumors, using them as a vaccine, if you will, right? I mean, that's a concept that's brand new or very new, and it's quite complicated. It introduces all sorts of new areas that we got to think about. So the innovation is going to take a lot of new thinking, and that's where innovation comes in, right? It's not just drugs, also devices. Devices are getting smart. Now we're looking at creating sort of nanoparticles that target certain tissues, sensors that are put into joints. I mean, there's a whole level of complexity that I think, I would say that the digital or technological revolution has really brought about. And I think they're going to be harder to come by. I just feel like what it means is that innovators have to readjust and broaden their thinking. To me, and this is the value of where a place like Yasmine and I sit in the LCI, where we look across different modalities. That we need more of that, right? Because that, to me, is the future. Things like device drug combinations or complicated devices that have both digital health aspects with, mechanical aspects. It's going to be more of sort of a bringing different disciplines together instead of to come up with these new innovations versus sort of being very focused deeply in one area. And again, this is probably a bias of mine based on where I've been the last 2 years, but I see that as a trend in the field.
One of your colleagues, Matt Parsons, was on the podcast with me about a year ago, and I was interested in his background and his diverse background and what that brought to LCI, and he talked about the cross-sector and functionality advantages of the program. And I guess getting back to my question about innovations and breakthroughs, there's some schools of thought saying that, well, maybe there's less innovation in some areas, at least maybe visibly, because specialization has become so detailed. So you have these hyper specialized people who are working on a specific cell, a specific molecule, whereas traditionally a lot of innovation comes at the edges of two areas, right? So a lot of innovation doesn't come from the center of a discipline, but it comes where the outside of that discipline is rubbing against another discipline. And there's an area there that's often where there's a gap, because these days you have these hyper-specialized experts who spend their entire lives looking at a specific molecule in this area. And then over here you have somebody doing the same thing. But actually the innovation is in somewhere at the edge where there's a cross function of disciplines going on. And so I don't know, it's just something that I've been thinking about lately is that, if it's true that innovation happens at the edge of these things, are we developing young potential innovators to be too hyper-specialized and therefore so myopic that maybe they lack that spark of innovation from not looking over the fence? Does that make any sense?
Oh, yeah, totally. I mean, Sean, you just described much more eloquently what I was trying to say before, right? Like the LCI is meant to explore those edges, right? That's what we're doing. And I think that's a concept that really resonates with me. And, as a generalist, right, I just told you my background, I started in general medicine, and I felt like I was always able to look at the edges, right? I was never the guy who was going to go deep in one area, but pulling together the expert that we needed to go explore the edge. And I think there's definitely some truth to that. I mean, certainly in my own career path, I've seen it. And I think it's definitely worth thinking about. Are we over specializing? I mean, you need that deep expertise. Don't get me wrong, right, Sean? I mean, if you don't have that expertise, you could be also just sort of always at the edges without really understanding the core, right?
Right.
Both, in my opinion.
Agreed. Yasmine, any thoughts around that?
I guess just the one thing that occurred to me is that I think touches on that same idea as different ways of thinking and the benefits of bringing those together. And I think one of the things that has been fun for me in working at LCI is, for example, having the opportunity to work with engineers. I'm very used to working with a group of people who've been trained in a similar way, with a clinical perspective, with for me to a lesser extent, with a basic science perspective. But engineers think about things very differently. Their approach to problem solving is very different. And so I think that's an edge too. And it's been fun for me to sort of learn from my colleagues like Matt and others who have that different approach to problem solving.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point, and I think that's also part of what I was trying to articulate before, and that is that it is often a matter of a habit of mind or a certain mindset that one brings to problem solving, which is why it always makes sense to have as much diversity within a team as possible in order to exploit all of those various ways of approaching problems. Now, many of our listeners are just starting out in their careers. We'd love to hear from each of you as to what kind of advice you may impart upon these young innovators. Philippe?
Well, I this is an area that it's very close to me just because I have what I think are young innovators in my family who are college-age students. I give them the same advice, right? Which is again, I'll go back to the more generalist, explore multiple disciplines, especially early on in your career, right? Try to get a broad perspective across, I guess in this case, engineering, bioengineering, mechanical, try to look at things all the way across the spectrum because as you get older, you do have the tendency to get more and more specialized. So if you don't start broad, you're never it's hard to go broad later. You should get start broad and then narrow in. I would also say, go with what you really love. Like what is it that you love to do? I know this sounds trite and probably, your parents told you the same thing, but you've got to, if you're not passionate about what you're doing, even at an early stage of your career, it may be a warning sign that that's maybe not the right place for you. Because, you start with a lot of enthusiasm and then that enthusiasm gets sort of more and more focused and you tend to lose it a little bit over time. So if you don't start with that enthusiasm, you're not in a great place moving forward. So follow your passions, do what you love, explore multiple areas, especially early in your career. And I guess one more that comes to mind is the power of networking and actually forcing yourself to meet and interact with people that think a little bit differently from you. That's just good life advice. But I think in your career, it's so important to make those connections with folks in other areas. And a place like Johnson & Johnson is a great place to do that because of the variety and the breadth of the folks that work in this great company. You can learn a lot from your peers, and that can help your career later on, either spark a new interest or you'll do a stretch assignment in another place or find a new role, another job. So those are the things that come to mind, Sean.
Yasmine, any thoughts on advice that you might impart on our early in career listeners?
I agree with what Philippe said. I think the only maybe aspect of it that I'll reiterate is just the importance of maintaining sort of open-mindedness about career options. And I think, I don't know if this is still true in certainly medical school and training, but I think I came out of that world with a pretty fixed mindset about what my path was supposed to be. I was supposed to become the triple threat physician, scientist, professor, and that was it. That was the path. And so it took me a long time to come around to the idea that there are other possibilities out there and that there are other rewarding careers. And so I would advise sort of younger folks to not take as long as I did to learn that lesson and just stay open to learn about what other people who've walked in your path how they've sort of worked through their careers and learn from their experience. There's a lot to be gained, a lot of time to be saved from learning from vicarious experience.
Right. Good advice. And finally, Philippe, what do you know now that you wish you knew then?
Well, I'll give you sort of a recent example, and it goes back to reinforcing this network. You're really only as good as the people you surround yourself with. Again, the training that I did was like Yasmine, is very focused and individually focused. But I feel like in the job that I am now, I'm only as good as the team that I'm surrounded by. And I'm very proud of surrounding myself with very good people because, and I didn't realize that at the time. I had this sort of more like go it alone mentality when I was younger, right? That's kind of how I was brought up. But you realize as you progress in your career that it's really about the team that you work with. And maybe that's different in different disciplines. I'm imagining the same is true in the engineering sciences. But certainly something that came to mind, about what I wish I had known back then. Mm-hmm.
Yasmine, any thoughts on that?
And I would just add that's not a weakness. I think we tend to perceive or can perceive kind of wanting to get someone else's opinion or to ask for help or to sort of leverage the brain trust around you as a weakness. You should be able to just figure it out yourself. And I guess that's one of the things that I've learned is it's so not, like you can make so many more mistakes just trying to go it alone than if you just sort of ask somebody else and have them help you think it through or share their experience. I find it a much better approach.
Mm-hmm. So be humble and expand your network. And don't think you have to solve everything by yourself, and surround yourself with smart people.
Yeah,
absolutely.
All good advice. Well, I want to thank you both so much for spending time with me today. I really enjoyed our conversation. And once again, congratulations on the Janssen Medal Award.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sean.
The Innovators Spotlight podcast is brought to you by Johnson & Johnson's R&D Leadership Development Program, cultivating tomorrow's innovation leaders in medical engineering and technologies. I'm Sean Grace. Thanks so much for listening.